Dreamweaver, Chapter 21 The Librarian. The Phoenix Gates opened its mouth wide to allow the large 8-lane traffic to enter and exit Yale. In a former life, Mariska visited frequently, though each time the city morphed and grew. It was no different this time as she watched from the back of an arc, a large open-top shuttle bus that ran on road wheels and track. The two enormous statues of a man and a woman on either side of the gates were new. Set completely in white marble, they were attractive, almost sublime, with faces that contained all the marks of beauty and a frame that only gods of myths and legends could attain. Yet, with awe of perfection in their creation, the statues gazed painfully downward, bending their necks until chins rested on chests, instead of heavenward where gods and angels resided. Mariska followed the statues until the arc passed through the gates. From the rear, she could see only their backs and the small, rounded hump of their bent necks. The warning was apparent and every bit as conspicuous as the statues' smiling faces that greeted the inbound traffic. She pulled the hood of the jacket over her head and tightened the drawstring as cold, invisible fingers tickled her neck and caressed her back. To the front, tall skyscrapers pierced the heaven and spiked the ground as they erupted through the city, populating the skyline in equally spaced intervals. Fanciful machines buzzed around, frantically destroying and building, always seeking to make the place more beautiful and more perfect than it had been. The arc stopped after having reached its destination. Several air trams whisked by, carrying passengers deeper into the bowels of the city. Mariska had no need to go any further. The Stuttering Hall's Memorial Library bordered the city center and lay on the campus of an old university, long known for sputtering rigid doctrines and ingraining undeserved pride into the fragile egos of the privileged but mediocre students. After the end of the world, its function remained much the same, and white-clad guardians spooked the grounds, extolling the deeds of the Great Purity, priding themselves in being amongst the few selected to uphold his beliefs. A few glanced at Mariska, another frail old woman, visiting the campus to admire its beautiful streets, clean lawns, and historic monuments, knowing that age and misfortune had deprived this poor soul of the chance to be closer to the great teacher. He smiled at her, nodded, and continued on, shoulders back, chest out, and head up. The guardians never denied anyone the opportunity to visit, to admire, and to envy. None knew her. She didn't expect them to. Her betrayal, such a scandal, such a mark on the guardians, would have never been mentioned except by those who knew. She had no choice in being a faithful. It was a burden thrust upon her. The Great Purity saved her, and she was his. His beliefs were hers, his will was hers, and her life was to be lived in accordance to his teachings. In the end, she deviated from the path set for her, and in doing so, she betrayed the guardianship. He said in the beginning, they were persecuted, crushed and squashed under the weight of mankind's ignorance and sin. It was through perseverance, belief, and the Great Purity's will that the guardians triumphed. The blossoming gardens and the magnificent cities were an attestation to that, and the Palace of Light, the most significant monument of all, had a direct, unobstructed view of heaven. Mariska had been there, and saw with her own eyes that amongst these beautiful embellishments were also the ugly realities. Under the guardianship, the populace traded away freedom for safety. Order occurred, but at the cost of justice. Now she wanted only facts, devoid of half-truths. The Stuttering Halls had them, but they weren't written in any text or professed in any lecture. The librarian and scribe of this new age who studied the Great Purity in obscene worship was the man she sought. Fallman, Mariska whispered as she pushed through the library doors. Somewhere along the upper levels of the library, a skinny, spectacled man dropped his pen. The uncontrollable tremor in his hand had gotten worse. He looked down at the manuscript and sighed. It was still far from finished, but time was not on his side. At night, he could feel the curtains of his life draw close, never to open again. He was afraid, cold sweat spilling from his goose-pimpled pores. The fire that once burned like a raging bonfire was reduced to a small, smoldering heap. His passion and love for the Great Purity was as deep, if not deeper, than before, but the strength to do his task had dwindled from age and disease. He chose to retire here, a place where he felt most comfortable, surrounded by memories of more glorified days. These were dark times indeed, and not just for himself. If he even closed his eyes, impure thoughts would enter his mind, soiling it with their dark filth. He bemoaned this useless body that made him unfit to continue the task originally assigned to him. To write the praises of the Great Purity always had been his most significant work, and made him important when he was worthless. He was on the verge of tears, and he pounded the desk with his weak hands. The thought sounded as full and heavy as his heartbeat. He jumped and glanced at the door. No one. Yet his heart leapt and bounded at a frantic, unsustainable pace. Something wasn't right. He trembled as genuine fear circulated through his body. It was time to leave. He swiftly gathered the unfinished manuscript and tucked it under his arm. He had reached the door when the knob turned. Overtaken by fear, he collapsed, shaky legs finally given out. "You," he spat, teeth clattering from an emotional outburst of fear and hate. "It's been a long time, Fallman," Mariska said, as she untied the drawstring and lifted her hood. "Traitorous ingrate," he muttered, and looked away as if the mere sight of her would taint him. She ignored him and sat at his desk. "Don't even think about screaming. You'll be dead before you utter a sound." "What do I have to fear? The Great Purity lives in my heart," the fanatic named Fallman declared. "I have some questions for you. And you think I'll answer them?" "You would, because it concerns your God." Fallman struggled to his feet. The spark behind his eyes told Mariska that he was very much interested in what she had to ask, but she waited. "How would the Great Purity ever be concerned by the likes of you?" The lie was already evident in his voice that lacked his usual authoritative zealotry. "Not by me, but perhaps someone like himself." "Nonsense," Fallman dismissed. "How many of the ill survived the clearing without the help of the Guardians?" "None. You should know that there is no cure beyond the grace of our great teacher." He purposely accentuated the word to remind her of her crime, but Mariska was beyond guilt for pursuing her own truth. This was something Fallman would never understand. "But if there were," she pressed, "that's ludicrous." "It's a fact. Michael's failures." Fallman's face turned pale. Her words twisted his heart. "Abomination." "But the Great Purity wants this abomination." "The Great Purity loves us all, for we are his children. He has given everyone a second life." "Many have survived without his aid." "Many more would have perished without it." Mariska sighed. She had forgotten the extent of their fanaticism. "The Great Purity hasn't given up on the child. What is the reason?" Fallman laughed, but it sounded like a sob from all the emotions wrecking his body. "Can we ever fathom his infinite wisdom?" "He's coming this way," Mariska said sternly. "Ainsley is coming." She kept her gaze on the man, taking in his subtle expressions. Every facial tick, shift of the eyes, tightening of the lips, or twitch of the mouth told what his heart would not. She stoked him further. "There is fear amongst the ranks, perhaps even within the Great Purity himself. That is why Ainsley is needed, to be a friend rather than foe. But he didn't go along, and so now you fear like they all do." Fallman shook his head violently. He could barely stand. "Fallacy," he expired. But it was through the breath of a dying man, for Fallman fell, his body collapsing into a lifeless heap, and the papers under his arms scattered onto the ground. Mariska stood up, mouth gaping and eyes bursting from shock. She didn't intend to kill him. She had come for information, not blood. Bending over his body, she checked his vitals, looking for a sign of life, and finding none. Her head drooped disappointingly. There was so much she wanted to know, and so much he could have told. In retrospect, the man did appear sickly, with thinning hair and lax, jaundiced skin, and her provocations proved too much for his weakened body. A piece of paper rustled under her soul, and Mariska picked it up. Her eyes narrowed to focus the light, and her hands quickly reached for the rest of the papers. This was an unfinished work, an honest piece, and the working title told her all that she wanted to know. Awakening Dreams. Thanks for staying and listening until the end. Let me know what you think of the story so far in the comment section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to get alerts on new chapters. Also, if so inclined, you can buy me coffee or preferably boba on Ko-fi. Link in the description below. Thanks for tuning in and see you next week.